The dour pessimists of the SI, increasingly headquartered in the Night Garden, had to rethink their theories. The scheduled doom these space amoebas were due to bring had not come about, and now the whole galaxy was revealed to be alive with civilizations new and old. Seeing the blocks of colour on the star charts made one feel much less alone. Human space was safely tucked into a herd of other societies. Surely nothing could destroy them all. That sentiment was as powerful as it was misguided. Civilization was mere specks in a void, tied together by hyperlanes that, as the First League had proven, were not guaranteed to be stable. On Scat 3A and Fenhabanis 3, two primary League worlds, SI crews were delving deep in search of clues, but were turning up nothing but precious metals and rich alien fauna. Seeing this, larger extraction facilities were arranged, for in the new great game of the galaxy, resources not stockpiled were resources closer to the claws of others. Clearly optimism had not won out yet. Indeed, the SI was beginning to actively encourage residents of their expanding cities on extrasolar planets. This was driven by two products of their initiation to galactic politics. First was a rule of the voting chamber, in which one's vote was weighted through a so-called stake algorithm. This determined what right the voter had to influence a given matter, and was roughly proxy for the power a civilization had over a decision. One aspect of the algorithm was a count of population, using a standardized system of measure based on how much energy one could exert. To put it another way, there were lots of Gorfs, so they would dominate a count of mere separate entities, but each Gorf did little on its own, so they were weighted lightly. Compared to the Fajazivlin, who were rare but deeply computational, a fair system was needed to determine how many things each power was representing. This weighted population count was the solution. The implication was that humans needed to multiply to ensure their voice was heard, and ensuring their voice was heard would serve the SI mandate. Therefore, reproductive rights were untethered, and a human diaspora began. The second factor at play was the intervention of the Babaki in human engineering. The same technology that allowed galaxy-wide policy-making in near real time could also be used to link up the virtuals of the various human colonies to the primary servers on Earth, and indeed to the Babaki equivalent. It was known as hyperlinking, on account of operating a little like a hyperlane, only on a quantum scale. With this arrangement, where one lived on the Terrestrial mattered a lot less, driving wave after wave of passenger transport ships out from Earth. Some of them travelled a long, long way, beyond Murphid, beyond humanity. Thin, cyan-streaked ships passed the other way. This was the landmark moment that closed out the year 2240, the first interspecies migrations. Humans donned their thermals and stepped into frigid Babaki habitats. Babaki deployed entropic ventilators to stay cool amid the waste heat of human apartment blocks. It was a limited experiment to begin with, but this was a turning point for the SI. If their goal was to preserve humanity forever, what were they meant to do with the human-esque migrants amid their ranks? Or indeed, what could they do without them? The Babaki had already proven themselves both benevolent friends and invaluable allies, but the SI was constitutionally mandated to act otherwise if push came to shove. As things stood, with not a push in sight, the Babaki carried on advocating for human legitimacy to the galactic community. In 2241, an important development pushed humans out of the firing line. They ceased to be the new creatures in the club. A growing power from the southern rim of the galaxy had made contact with a deep space exploration mission led by Pir Meiji, and she quickly routed their comms through the hyperlane network. Now the humans got a chance to pull back someone else's curtain. This new civilization was announced by freshly elected First Pir Otta, a rare privilege indeed. Who they were was almost secondary to this. but they were of interest all the same. They called themselves Ultur, or sometimes a word that roughly translated to the tribes. They were aquatic beings with a recently discovered penchant for landlubbing. In appearance, they were like corals, with a rich variety of colours among them. Each being had two particular colours they sported, a primary and a secondary. From their calcified bodies protruded arms like those of a squid, numbered seemingly at random from being to being. These were poked through thin veils of ruffled cloth, which was dyed in the primary colour of each individual, and covered with jewellery shimmering in their secondary colour. Altogether, they had a striking yet unsettling look, but any fear one felt was misguided, for they had no use for confrontation. They were entirely delighted to work with the galaxy, leaking bubbling fluids from pores in their coral heads, a good sign as it turned out. The interest in cooperation was so strong as to be sinister. They would gain a reputation for being openly sour at the success of others, for it was in the failure of others that they sought chances to reach out and provide aid, thus furthering their mutualist goals. As such, they were entirely against the matter of mandatory recycling regulations, which was still the matter of the day after years of deliberation. With this in mind, the Ultur were not especially popular, but they either did not understand this, or were happy to wait for ends to justify their means. Domestically, in the 2240s, the SI was racing for the galaxy's northern edge. The layout of the hyperlanes was such that the northeast corner of the galaxy was accessible only through human-controlled areas around Murfid or from the Babaki northern frontier. As such, it was natural that one or the other would ultimately expand into the region. The SI, to preserve humanity forever, had to get there first. The Babaki, knowing full well what the SI were planning to take from them, did nothing. While the Babaki could be just as confrontational as the humans, they considered the humans not just allies, but as a kind of wealth. Humans were fascinating to study, and the best of them could help with higher science, the deepest and utmost fascination of the Babaki elites. This meant that no formal complaints were lodged, as the SI cynically began claiming all the key hyperlane junctions of the northeast. The claiming process was quite simple, thanks to existing galactic law. The notion of territory in space was a little ambiguous, especially given that almost all the so-called territory a power could claim was just vacuum. But hyperlane entrances meant something, habitable planets meant something, and unprospected asteroid belts and gas giants meant a whole lot. Therefore, it was deemed legal to add a solar system to a government's jurisdiction under three conditions. One, that the jurisdiction did not extend past the termination shock boundary of the star. This was the distance at which the solar wind no longer pushed back the interstellar medium through which the star travelled. 2. That the solar system had to contain at least one micropop of the government's primary species. That was about 200 to 300 people for humans. And 3. That hyperlane communications probes were to be established and maintained by the governing body. Therefore, groups of 200 to 300 SI staff were constantly having their offices relocated to cramped, rapidly assembled space stations in a variety of no-name systems along the Babaki frontier. As long as some other office somewhere was making sure food haulers kept on stopping by, these were peaceful little void dustbins to inhabit. In 2243, there was a particularly thrilling 4D experience circulating in the virtual. It was a clip from the Avendari monitoring channel, showing off an enormous explosion in the middle of their bluer-than-blue ocean. The SI's pets had come across nuclear fission. This was the point in the story where the SI should sweep down and reveal themselves to prevent the Avendari from destroying their planet. But that was not as dramatic as seeing how close they actually got, and furthermore, non-intervention was vital to the social experiments the scientists in the Overwatch station above were carrying on. Therefore, a potent window for making contact came and went, and all were happier for it. By 2246, Peer Yushin had almost led the human expeditions right to the edge of the galaxy. There, in quiet systems far from the dust, radiation and rogue bodies of the interior, a new class of life drifted into view. Yushin reported that flotillas of living rock were cruising in wide orbits of stars. Their life was evidenced by their reaction to being approached. Normally a greyish-white in colour, they shimmered blue and emitted powerful electromagnetic fields when SI probes tumbled towards them. The probes were fried, and then when all was clear, the huge crystalline beings became inert once more. The Babaki had logged these on their own expeditions, and called them sapphire quintessences. That was a very Babaki name, so the SI called them crystal sovereigns. Years-long study of how they were licking out with electromagnetic fields was the first major joint study of human and Babaki scientists. It was a powerful union, for the Babaki could determine how a phenomena worked, while the humans determined how to use it to save resources. A decade later, a particular fashion of wiring solar arrays would owe its existence to Yushin's mad dash for the frontier. The Exile was also conducting expeditions in the region, focusing on the uncharted zone that Yushin's flag planting had now cut off from the galactic community. She discovered the first of 2249's 3 great relics. On Barban 3A, a dead moon at the end of a long, lonely hyperlane to the rim, she found a computer the size of a space station. It was buried underground and was processing something. That much was clear from the spikes in magnetism when its pillarous processes crescendoed in waves of activity. Its power source was assumably buried further still. The Exile was about to destroy the machine and bring the parts back to the SI for a reward, but her not entirely human philosophy didn't appreciate the lifeness of a computer in the same way the Council of Peers did. Peer Otta ordered the Exile to leave it alone, and if there was anything her non-human mindset excelled at, it was following orders. Signal analysis was performed, and by tracking the movement of electrons through the labyrinthine machine, an emulator was developed. With this, the SI could determine that the computer had been running for thousands of years, and was attempting to brute force a solution to a mathematical problem. The problem was unknown, and given the complexity of what the machine was doing to find solutions, it was going to stay that way. However, the fact that the SI attempted to find it did not go undetected by the machine itself, which quietly slipped a message off through something akin to a hyperlink. Then came the discovery of the second relic. It was on a planet dubbed Unity by the rapidly assembled pseudo-colony the SI had built there. Unity was on the primary belt to the collective, and was a show home of sorts. This lovely Earth-like planet had a secret below its oceans, and in 2249 it was dragged to the surface, an intact spaceship from 7,000 years prior. It was not just intact, but perfectly preserved. It was a battle cruiser, rounded and armoured in the front, and bristling with emitters and ports to the rear. The interior was very spacious for humans, as whatever had crewed it was clearly much bigger than them. There were a few manually controlled elements inside, the shape of which indicated opposable thumbs and great strength assumed of the user. Playing with the controls brought a surprise. The ship suddenly powered on and flung itself into space without warning. It was being repelled by the planet's gravity. Several robots and 3 real explorers were flattened by the force of it. Then the cruiser hung in orbit and pinged out a signal in all directions. The signal was clearly an intelligent message, but the language was unknown. This was no Uvazivani wreck, as had been the leading speculation given its proximity to their sleeping domain. It belonged to those who replied to the signal. Those who had been missing a battlecruiser for a very long time. They were the Imatharans, or as they quickly came to be known, the Imatharan Ancients. To them, the Uvazivani were mere children too. They were the third relic of 2249, and relic was all they were, for how they existed then was less than a shadow of how they had lived when the battle cruiser had first set sail. They had holed themselves up in a cluster of stars west of the Justcan in the southwestern portion of the galaxy. Surrounded by singularities and thick nebulae, they had sat back and monitored the galaxy for millennia. They noted their surprise at how quickly and readily the humans had stepped up to join the galactic community. It was like a compliment from the head teacher. The Imitharans are best described as upright standing horses in typically golden regalia, with nostrils high on their face right beside their side-facing monocular eyes. They were long-lived to the point of immortality, compared to human lifespans anyway, and they concerned themselves with business that they claimed could not be explained to others. Keeping an eye on the galaxy was a side hobby of sorts, but they gave ready assurances that no one need pay them any attention. At one time they had warred with the Uvazavani, but in that era, 6,000 years prior, the galaxy had been quiet and empty. 3,000 years further back it had been different, they explained, but they were not planning to divulge the story of the previous generation of galactic spacefarers. They said that only they and the Uvazavani passed the threshold, and they had both warred with each other in the aftermath. Now the Imutharans had no need for war, so little so that they were happy for the SI to keep the battlecruiser. After lengthy lessons on its operation, it flew to the new SI Forward Operations Station in the SCAT system, the military command post from which the Uvazavani and Tuxcan Combine were being monitored. It was a show of force, the language of humanity's belligerent rivals. The cruiser itself was a magnificent work of engineering, and reverse engineering an automatic version for use with a hyperlinked human crew could bring about a new wave of military innovation in time. The Imitharans sent Justcan scientists to aid the endeavour, and from the way the Justcan spoke of their sponsors, it was obvious they had been secretly aware of the Ancients previously. An official diplomatic congratulations on becoming worthy enough was sent from the Justcan Ascendancy, which was a fancy title for their central, all-powerful, all-knowing government. This period of cooperation led to the first migrations of Justcan to SI worlds at the beginning of the 2250s. At the same time, migrating Babaki were bringing along their companion Gorfs, and the legal regulations required to manage that opened the borders up for Gorfs to independently live in human colonies as well. The SI wards were now 4 species wide, albeit the non-humans were negligible in number. This would not remain the case, for these other species could further the SI mandate in a unique way. The Justcan could live well in arid conditions, and the Babaki thrived in the cold. Plans were drawn up for colonies on planets with ecosystems hostile to humans, but tolerable to the aliens. In this way, the labour of the non-humans could be used to create infrastructure and extract resources that the SI as a whole would own, and could direct to the humans at their own discretion. A complete system along these lines was far off, but from the very beginning of alien migration, these ideas were circulating at the highest level of the SI, whether they wanted to entertain them or not. It was not an especially ethical arrangement, but in theory, the colonists would be voting citizens and could be elected. In practice, the chance of the humans actually electing a Justcan who came across as extremely arrogant were slim. The Babaki fared better, but it took a certain level of education to appreciate their tightly woven poetics and sharp, manic speech. So then, a minority of others was not going to thrive democratically speaking, and for the time being, it favoured the SI to maintain the illusion that this was anything other than the fault of the democratic rules themselves. This caused a divide as rapid as it was irreparable. There were hundreds of SI peers and administrators who had strong philosophical objections to using alien labour for human means. Labour colonialism, it was dubbed, or capitalism even. The SI Council of Peers were stone-faced, having no especially viable response other than to appeal to a literalist reading of the 100-year-old SI mandate. It was not convincing enough. In 2255, SI rogues gathered a few weaponized ships and blocked the hyperlane in the Toa system in protest. This was a lane that linked Earth's local group of stars to the branches of the hyperlane leading to the primary belt and all the mines of the less fake than ever colonies. The SI would have to listen, the rogues thought. But instead, the SI thought only of reopening the lane and silencing this armed dissent. As it happened, they had a quick way to do it. The method hinged upon the re-emergence of space amoebas, which were quite numerous in the galactic northeast. They did not appear to be native to any particular place, but had perhaps been driven there by the rise of civilization across the galaxy. Now they were very much in the way, and they made their presence very clear by destroying 2 of the SI's tin can stations in the region. For that purpose, the SI Space Navy had been assembled and deployed, sailing from the forward base on the other side of the blockade. They blasted into the Toa system with lasers charged, cutting through the blockade from a distance, then closing in to silence the pieces. Under normal circumstances, it would have been possible to keep this whole affair internal, but the rogues had enhanced their protest by having a few of the blockade ships be crewed in person. Among the debris now in distant orbit of Toa was blood. The SI worked quickly and efficiently. The debris was ejected into deep space within a few days, and even sooner, news of the event was published. The pirates of Toa had been defeated. Good news. It was strange that pirates would suddenly make such a brazen move, but the SI had rightfully punished them for it, and the ringleaders had been captured alive, so no long-term harm was done. Then, the actual SI personnel killed in the action were slipped in among the dead listed on reports of amoeba attacks. It was by no means the end of the matter, for the vast majority of the rogues were not only still at large, but still doing their day jobs within the very SI that was being so intolerant of them. It was a rather measured kind of protest, to say the least. But now that lives had been lost, the matter was debated openly in the Council of Peers and lesser assemblies. These debates always reached the ultimate impasse that while the aliens had been given the legal right to colonize SI worlds, the SI couldn't budget for bringing them in if their labor wasn't colonized in return. Trapped at this juncture, the status quo reigned, and other matters knocked at the door. The big event that finally swept these ethics debates off the landing pages came in 2257 in the midst of the unannounced, unnamed war with the northern space amoebas. The SI fleet had pacified the already claimed systems, and was about to press out down the next untapped lane to clear the path ahead, but suddenly they were not needed. A massive flotilla of irregular, scarred ships fell from the hyperlanes on the east side of the Stebnar system, just as Jesse Quinn and the SI fleet fell in from the west. The unknown flotilla ploughed forwards into a swarm of amoebas, including the recently discovered mother amoeba species, 5 times the size of the previously encountered variant, and lined with flagella strong enough to cut a spaceship in half. For all their strength, they melted away when the flotilla released a barrage of explosive projectiles and focused energy beams. Within minutes, the luminescent host was dead, and the SI Navy was left bow to bow with a silent battle fleet. An exchange of signals was made, but neither side could comprehend the other, so it was back to square one, transmitting mathematical axioms and translation keys. Pessimists were again ready for doom to be announced, but this wasn't it either. This meeting would in fact begin to reveal a piece of the Imatharan puzzle that had been deliberately misplaced. It was a piece that would set the SI on a path to war.